Tyler Reynolds made Ridgewood High his personal kingdom, a bully who did as he pleased. Jaden Carter was one of his favorite targets. Pushed, beaten, mocked, and with a powerful father to protect him, Tyler never faced consequences. Jaden endured it, day after day, year after year. He learned to keep his head down, to take the blows, to pretend it didn't matter, but it did. Then, one day, everything changed. Jaden came home beaten worse than ever, and for the first time, his father, Daniel Carter, a former Delta Force operative, saw the truth, the bruises, the unspoken weight of years of suffering, and he made a decision: no more. His father pushed him beyond his limits, teaching him what it meant to stand his ground, to take control, to strike back with precision and power. And when the moment finally came, Jaden didn't hesitate. Tyler thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The morning sun cast a golden glow over Ridgewood High, its red brick exterior standing tall against the crisp autumn air. Students spilling into its halls in clusters, some engaged in carefree laughter, others moving in silent indifference. To most, this was just another day, another cycle of classes and routine. But for Jaden, every step through these corridors carried the weight of an unspoken truth. This school wasn't built for kids like him. He had learned early on that silence was often the safest response, that choosing to look away instead of engaging could mean the difference between making it through the day or being swallowed whole by the ever-present undercurrent of hostility that Ridgewood carried. It wasn't always blatant. Sometimes it was a sharp glance when he raised his hand in class, a smirk when he walked past a table in the cafeteria, a laugh when he brushed shoulders with someone who acted like he didn't belong. Other times, though, it was clearer, sharper, unmistakable in its intent. Like now, Jaden barely had time to register the rough shove against his shoulder before his books hit the ground, his body stumbling forward as the crowded hallway split apart. A familiar voice carrying over the chatter, loud and taunting. "Oops! Didn't see you there, Jaden." Tyler. He stood there, smirking, eyes glinting with something sharp, something cruel. As his friends loomed behind him, entertained, amused, watching Jaden with the expectation that he would do what he always did: pick up his books, ignore the insult, and walk away. Jaden exhaled slowly, steadying himself, forcing his expression to remain blank, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. "I said," Tyler continued, stepping closer, voice dropping just enough for only Jaden to hear. "Watch where you're walking, boy." A ripple of tension rolled through the surrounding students. Some turned away, pretending not to hear. Others exchanged uneasy glances. But no one spoke. No one ever did. Jaden's jaw tightened. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the familiar burn of frustration that came with moments like these, the battle between wanting to react and knowing what it would cost him if he did. He had been raised better than this. His father had taught him that some fights weren't worth having, that some battles only fed the enemy. But standing there, staring into Tyler's smirking face, he wondered if that was always true. But before the thought could settle, before he could do anything, Tyler struck again, a hand against his chest, a shove, harder this time, forcing him back a step. "What's wrong?" Tyler grinned, voice dripping with mock innocence. "Aren't you gonna do something? Or are you just gonna stand there like a good little—" The sudden weight of silence swallowed the rest of his words, the hush in the hallway stretching thin as everyone watched. Waiting, breath held in anticipation. Jaden felt his hands clench at his sides. He could hear his father's voice in his head. "Don't react in anger. Control the fight before it begins." But how much longer was he supposed to take this? Seconds stretched, thick with expectation. But in the end, Jaden did what he had always done. He let out a slow breath, forced his hands to relax, then bent down and started gathering his books. Laughter rippled through the crowd as Tyler chuckled, satisfied, nudging one of the books further away with his foot. "Smart choice, Jaden. Stay in your lane." Then he was gone, disappearing down the hall with his entourage, their laughter fading, leaving Jayden on the cold tile floor, staring at the pages of his notebook, the words he had written that morning, the words that suddenly felt so small, so meaningless. He knew what people would say, that he had done the right thing, that walking away was the mature response, that violence wasn't the answer. But deep down, as he pushed himself to his feet and met the cautious eyes of the few students who lingered, he knew the truth. He had lost, again, and he wasn't sure how many more losses he could take. By the time he made it home that evening, the frustration had settled into something deeper, heavier, something that burned under his skin as he stood in the garage, fists slamming against the worn-out punching bag, the dull thud echoing in the quiet. Daniel Carter, standing near the tool bench, watched his son from the corner of his eye. He wasn't the type to pry, never had been. But he wasn't blind either. The way Jayden's movements carried a tension that wasn't there before, the way his shoulders had started holding the weight of something unspoken, the way he never quite met his father's gaze anymore, it told him all he needed to know. Something was wrong, but Jayden wasn't ready to say it. Not yet, so Daniel let it be. For now, you're wasting energy, he said finally. Voice even, measured. Your stance is too stiff. Every punch should be controlled, not thrown just to feel something. Jayden stilled for only a moment before exhaling sharply, stepping back, shaking out his hands. He hesitated, his frustration catching in his throat, before shaking his head. I don't know. It just doesn't feel like enough. Daniel studied him for a long moment before stepping forward, pressing a hand against the bag, stilling it completely. Enough for what? Jayden didn't answer. His father held his gaze, waiting. But when no words came, he nodded slightly, stepping back, letting the silence settle. You want to learn how to fight? He asked after a moment, voice calm, deliberate. Jayden hesitated only a second before nodding. Daniel's lips quirked slightly, something sharp and knowing flashing in his eyes. Then we start tomorrow. Jayden felt his pulse quicken, but this time it wasn't frustration burning in his chest. It was something else, something new, something that tasted like resolve. The days blurred together in a cycle that had long become familiar. Jayden walking the halls of Ridgewood High, blending into the background, avoiding unnecessary conflict, knowing all too well that a wrong move could turn an already uncomfortable existence into something far worse. He had gotten good at maneuvering around the school's unspoken rules, at recognizing the moments where speaking up wasn't worth the fallout, at choosing restraint over resistance, because that's what had always been expected of him. But something had shifted after that last encounter with Tyler. Maybe it was the way Tyler had laughed as he walked away, that smug, entitled expression, as if the outcome had never been in question. Maybe it was the way the students had looked at Jayden afterward, not with pity or sympathy, but with quiet acceptance, as if his humiliation had been inevitable. Or maybe it was the way his father had studied him in the garage that night, the knowing look in his eyes as he spoke of control, of finishing fights rather than starting them. Whatever it was, it lingered. It burned beneath the surface, silent but persistent, fueling every hour he spent in the gym after school, every session where his father pushed him harder, correcting his form, refining his movements, making him faster, stronger. There was no grand speech, no dramatic declaration about revenge, just repetition, discipline, control. Each lesson drilled into him a single truth. Strength wasn't about throwing the first punch. It was about knowing when to strike and making it count. And yet, when the moment finally came, when he found himself standing in the Ridgewood High parking lot, face to face with Tyler and his crew, all of that training, all of that preparation, felt like a distant memory. The sun had barely started its descent when Jayden heard his name called across the lot, a voice laced with mockery and something sharper, anticipation. He had felt it all day, the way Tyler had been watching him in class, the way his presence had loomed heavier than usual. And now, as Jayden turned to see him leaning casually against his car, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the edges of his mouth, he knew exactly what was about to happen. A few students had gathered, lingering near their own cars, some exchanging quiet murmurs, others pretending not to watch. But they were watching. They always watched. Jayden forced himself to stay calm, to keep his expression unreadable as Tyler pushed off his car and took a slow, deliberate step forward, his voice carrying over the quiet hum of conversation. "Heard you've been working out, Jayden," he mused, tilting his head slightly, like he was genuinely curious. "That true?" Jayden didn't respond. Tyler's smirk widened. "Oh, come on. I think it's cute. You really thought lifting a few weights was gonna make a difference?" He stepped closer, closing the distance between them, his voice lowering just slightly. "You don't belong here, and nothing you do is ever gonna change that." Jayden swallowed, forcing himself to stand still, to keep his breathing even. But Tyler could sense hesitation, and hesitation was weakness. The first shove came fast, harder than usual, enough to send Jayden stumbling back a step. The crowd stirred. Jayden steadied himself, inhaling sharply, trying to push back the instinct to react. Tyler's eyes gleamed with amusement, sensing the restraint, the effort, and he wasn't done. Another shove, even harder. This time Jayden's back hit the side of a car. Laughter rippled through the group. Something inside Jayden coiled tight. He could hear his father's voice in his head. "You don't win fights by reacting. You win them by controlling the fight before it begins." But right now, Tyler had control. Jayden wasn't ready, and Tyler knew it. A sharp crack rang out as Tyler's hand slapped Jayden across the face. An open palm hit, meant for humiliation rather than damage, the sound splitting through the air and sending a fresh wave of laughter through the onlookers. Jayden's face burned. His breath stilled in his chest. And just like that, every ounce of training, every second spent preparing for a moment like this, disappeared. Tyler saw it in his eyes. The hesitation, the doubt, the uncertainty that hadn't fully left him yet. And so he struck again. Not with a slap this time, but with a fist. The punch came fast. And this time, Jayden wasn't quick enough to move. It caught him clean across the jaw, sending a jolt of pain through his skull, his vision blurring for a second as he staggered, losing his footing. Before he could recover, Tyler was on him, driving him backward, fists swinging, pushing him down, feeding off the momentum, the laughter, the approval of the crowd. Jayden tried to swing back, but Tyler was stronger, heavier, and before he knew it, his back hit the pavement, the world spinning for a moment before a knee pressed against his chest, pinning him in place. Tyler's breath was uneven, his face flushed with exertion, but his grin never wavered. "You're pathetic," he murmured, just loud enough for Jayden to hear. Jayden tried to shove him off, but Tyler didn't budge. The crowd leaned in, murmuring, waiting, some entertained, others shifting uncomfortably. But no one stepped in. And then, just when Jayden thought it was over, just when he thought Tyler would finally back off, he felt the slow, deliberate weight of spit landing on his cheek. The laughter that followed was deafening. Tyler finally pushed himself up, stepping back, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "Stay down, Jayden," he called over his shoulder as he turned away, his friends falling in beside him, the group dispersing as if nothing had happened. "You always do." Jayden didn't move, not immediately. His cheek stung, his ribs ached, his pride was gone. He could still hear them laughing, still feel the weight of every eye that had watched him fall and done nothing. For a long moment, he simply lay there, staring up at the sky, the world blurred around the edges, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. Then, slowly, shakily, he pushed himself up. He didn't say anything, didn't look at anyone. He just walked away. And when he finally got home that night, his father took one look at him, at the swollen bruise forming along his jaw, the cut on his lip, the stiffness in his movements, and for the first time, Daniel Carter understood. The air in the Carter household was heavier than usual that night, not with words, but with silence, thick and weighted, settling between father and son like an unspoken understanding neither had dared to acknowledge until now. Jayden sat at the dining table, untouched food in front of him, his movements slow, methodical, as he pushed a fork idly against his plate, his mind distant, replaying every second of that afternoon's humiliation in the parking lot. Every fist, every shove, every piece of laughter that had cut deeper than Tyler's blows ever could. Across from him, Daniel Carter watched. He had noticed the shift in Jayden for weeks, the tension in his shoulders, the way he seemed quieter, more withdrawn. But now, staring at the bruises forming along his jaw, the split in his lower lip, the dullness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, there was no need to ask if something was wrong. He already knew the answer. What he didn't know was why his son had chosen to keep this from him. A long moment passed before Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm but firm, steady in the way a man's voice could only be after spending a lifetime controlling it. "Tell me what's happening at that school." Jayden's grip tightened slightly around his fork, his eyes dropping to his plate. "Nothing," he muttered. Daniel leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, gaze unwavering. "Try again." Jayden exhaled, sharp and frustrated, pushing his plate away as he sat back in his chair. "It doesn't matter." Daniel's brow lifted slightly. "Doesn't matter." His voice didn't rise, but there was something in it now. Something firm, something unyielding. "You come home looking like that and expect me to believe it doesn't matter?" Jayden's jaw clenched, but still, he said nothing. His father studied him for a moment longer before shaking his head, sitting back. "You think I don't know what this is?" He motioned toward him, toward the bruises, the exhaustion, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You think I haven't been where you are?" Jayden's gaze flickered up, just for a second. Daniel let out a breath, slow and deliberate, before leaning forward again, folding his hands together. "You ever hear the story about how I got my first promotion?" Jayden didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. "I was 23, fresh out of Ranger School, just made it into the unit," Daniel continued, his voice steady, the weight of memory settling into his tone. "New guys, we were always tested, pushed around, not in any way that left a mark, but we knew what it was. They wanted to see what we were made of." He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "One guy, Staff Sergeant Haynes, he made it his personal mission to remind me every day that I wasn't one of them yet. Every mistake, he made sure everyone knew about it. Every small victory, he made sure it didn't mean a damn thing." Jayden listened, his expression unreadable, but Daniel could see the way his shoulders had tensed, the way he had leaned in just slightly. "One night," Daniel continued, "we were on a training exercise, high stakes, high pressure. I nailed my role perfectly. Should have been a win. Instead, Haynes made a scene, tore me down in front of the others, called me a liability, a mistake, tried to make me believe it." He paused, then exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "And I almost did, almost let him make me doubt myself, almost accepted that I was the one who needed to back down." Jayden swallowed, but still didn't speak. Daniel's eyes locked onto his son's. "You know what I did?" Jayden hesitated before shaking his head. Daniel's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. Something sharper, something raw. "I put him on the ground." A flicker of something crossed Jayden's face. Not just surprise, but something deeper. Daniel leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "I waited. I trained harder, pushed myself past every limit I thought I had. And when the time came, when it really mattered, I put him down in front of everyone. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I was angry, but because I had to. Because if I didn't, if I let him take that from me, it would have never stopped." The room was silent. Then, finally, Daniel spoke again. "That's what you have to do." Jayden's throat felt tight. "It's different," he muttered. "You don't get it." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "I don't?" Jayden hesitated, then let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. "You were a soldier, in a unit. You had a mission. I'm just a kid in some school, dealing with an idiot who— You think a bully's any different just because he wears a different uniform? Daniel cut in, voice quiet but firm. You think the rules change just because the battlefield looks different? Jaden didn't have an answer for that. His father leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his expression hard but not unkind. They're all the same, he continued. Men like Haynes, men like Tyler. They push because they want to see you fall. And when you don't, when you take it and never push back, it tells them they can keep going. Jaden stared at him. His father's expression didn't change. That's why I'm going to train you, Daniel said simply. And I mean really train you. No more hitting a bag to work out your frustration. No more just throwing punches in the garage. You are going to learn how to fight, how to win. You're going to learn what it means to take power back. Jaden felt his heart hammering against his ribs, but he kept his voice steady. And what happens when I do? Daniel met his eyes, his voice absolute. Then you finish it. The words settled between them, final, undeniable. Jaden inhaled slowly, something shifting inside him, something that felt like certainty, like the last piece falling into place. He nodded once. His father nodded back. And just like that, the training truly began. The mornings started earlier now. The nights stretched longer. The weight on Jaden's shoulders, once just the burden of silence and humiliation, had shifted into something tangible, something that burned in his muscles, settled in his bones, pushed him forward when exhaustion clawed at him. His father was relentless. There were no shortcuts, no easy lessons, only discipline, only sweat, only pain. The first morning of training, Jaden had expected to step into the garage, throw a few punches at the bag, maybe some drills. But that wasn't how Daniel Carter trained soldiers, and it wasn't how he was going to train his son. Instead, his father had pointed to the door. Run, he had said. Arms crossed, his face unreadable. Jaden had frowned. How far? Daniel's answer had been simple. Until I say, stop. And so, he had run. At first, it had been easy. His legs carried him effortlessly, his breath came steady. But as the minutes stretched into miles, as the cold morning air clawed at his lungs, as his body started screaming for him to slow down, he had begun to understand. This wasn't about speed. It wasn't about endurance. It was about breaking the part of him that wanted to quit before it even began. He had pushed until his legs trembled, until his throat was raw with gasped breaths. And when he had finally stopped, when he had turned back expecting to see his father waiting with approval, Daniel had just stared at him, eyes sharp, unreadable. You done? Jaden had wiped sweat from his brow, his breathing uneven. Then, gritting his teeth, he had shaken his head. Daniel had nodded. Good. Keep going. And that had been the first day. The same pattern continued the next morning, and the one after that. Each day began the same way, running before the sun had fully risen, pushing his body past what it thought was possible, learning that exhaustion wasn't an excuse, but a state of mind that could be ignored, controlled, defeated. After the runs came the drills. His father didn't waste time on complicated movements, never let him indulge in flashy combinations meant to impress. Every strike had a purpose. Every movement had a reason. Speed doesn't mean a damn thing if your footing is wrong, Daniel had told him, voice even, watching like a predator watching its cub learn to hunt. You don't need 10 punches. You need one that counts. Jaden had listened. He had learned. And then, after hours of relentless practice, came the sparring. The first time they stepped onto the mat in the garage, Jaden had expected to feel some level of control, some small sense of preparedness after everything he had learned. But the first hit came faster than he expected, a sharp jab to the ribs before he had even fully settled into his stance. He had stumbled, gasping, instinctively raising his hands to block, but his father was already moving. A strike to the side, another to the gut. Not enough to injure, not enough to cause real damage, but enough to drive home a single, Undeniable truth. He wasn't ready. "You think this is about anger?" Daniel had asked, stepping back, watching as Jaden struggled to catch his breath. "You think this is about standing there and throwing wild punches?" Jaden had wiped blood from his lip, breathing hard. Daniel had shaken his head. "This is about control. It's about knowing exactly when to hit and making sure it's the last one you need." He had gestured for Jaden to get up, his voice steady, unrelenting. Again, and so, every day, they had gone again. Jaden got faster. Jaden got stronger. But more than anything, Jaden learned. The punches that had once sent him staggering now barely knocked him off balance. His father still hit hard, still tested him. But Jaden's body moved differently now, instinctively, precisely, like he wasn't just reacting, but predicting. One evening, as they squared off again, something changed. Jaden had ducked at the right moment, pivoted on instinct, and landed a sharp, clean strike to his father's ribs before he could counter. Daniel had taken a step back, nodding slightly, rubbing his side where the hit had landed. For the first time, his father grinned. "Now you're thinking," he had said, the closest thing to praise he had ever given. Jaden had smirked, rolling his shoulders, for the first time actually feeling ready. But outside of that garage, outside of the sweat and the training and the bruises, Ridgewood High hadn't changed. If anything, the bullying had only grown worse. Tyler wasn't an idiot. He could sense something was different. Maybe it was the way Jaden didn't flinch anymore when he approached, the way he held his ground instead of backing away, the way the usual insults and shoves didn't land the way they used to. Tyler wasn't used to not getting a reaction, and it infuriated him. So he escalated. Jaden's locker was trashed twice. His books were knocked from his hands more times than he could count. One day in the cafeteria, Tyler had grabbed his tray right out of his hands, smirking as he dumped the food onto the floor. "Pick it up, boy," he had sneered, voice dripping with mockery. Jaden had just stared at him. His hands had clenched at his sides. His pulse had hammered. Every fiber of his being had screamed for him to react. But he didn't, not yet, because he was waiting for the right moment, waiting for the moment his father had told him about, waiting for the moment where there would be no teachers, no crowd of friends backing Tyler up, no distractions, waiting for the moment where he could finish it. And that moment was coming. For weeks, he had felt it building, a quiet, simmering tension, a storm forming at the edges of every school day, waiting for the right moment to break. He had seen it in the way Tyler had watched him, the way his usual taunts had become sharper, the way the frustration had begun bleeding through the cracks in his cocky smirk every time Jaden refused to give him the reaction he wanted. Tyler wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to seeing someone he had knocked down get back up without fear in their eyes. And so, Jaden had waited. He had endured the shoves, the insults, the humiliation that Tyler had thrown at him in a desperate attempt to force him back into place. He had ignored the voices in the cafeteria, the laughter in the hallways, the food knocked from his hands, because he wasn't just looking for payback. He wasn't looking for revenge in a crowded hallway or in front of an audience of whispering students. He was looking for the moment when Tyler would be alone. And when that moment finally arrived, Jaden didn't hesitate. The school parking lot was nearly empty when Jaden stepped outside that afternoon, the late-day sun casting long shadows across the pavement, the last few students filtering into their cars, lost in their own conversations, their own worlds. He had been expecting it today, had felt it the second he had locked eyes with Tyler in class, had seen it in the way the other boy had looked at him, like something had already been decided. And now, as he turned the corner behind the school, he wasn't surprised to see Tyler already there, leaning against the back wall near the maintenance shed, arms crossed, waiting, no crowd, no backup, just him for the first time. Jaden didn't slow, didn't stop, didn't change his pace as he approached, his heart steady, his body already ready. Tyler pushed off the wall, that familiar smirk curling at the edges of his mouth. But there was something underneath it now. Something different. "Been waiting for you, Jaden," he said, voice casual. Too casual. Jaden stopped a few feet away, meeting his gaze, saying nothing. Tyler tilted his head slightly, studying him. "You've been acting different lately." His voice was still light, but there was a sharpness in it now, something colder. "Walking around like you don't know your place anymore. Like you've forgotten who I am." Jaden exhaled slowly. "I know exactly who you are." Tyler's smirk widened. "Yeah?" He took a step forward. "Then you should know what happens next." Jaden did know. He had always known. And this time, he was ready. Tyler moved first. It was fast, faster than Jaden had expected, but not faster than he could react. The punch came wide, telegraphed, the same mistake he had made during their first fight in the parking lot. Jaden didn't move back. He didn't flinch. He stepped into it. His left hand snapped up, deflecting the punch mid-air, redirecting the momentum. Tyler barely had time to register the shift before Jaden countered. A sharp strike to the ribs, fast, controlled, precise. Tyler staggered back, breath hitching, shock flashing across his face. Jaden didn't wait. He advanced. A quick step forward, a controlled combination, a jab, a hook, a strike that clipped Tyler's jaw just enough to send him stumbling. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't wild. It was measured, calculated. Tyler regained his footing, his expression twisting with fury. "You think—" He barely got the words out before he lunged again, his movements sloppier now, his anger bleeding into his form. Jaden didn't fall for it. He sidestepped, let Tyler's own momentum work against him. His footwork was solid now, his stance unshakable, his body moving on instinct. Tyler swung again, desperate now, but Jaden was already inside his space, already seeing the opening before it happened. And this time, he didn't hold back. A final strike, clean, direct, undeniable, connected with Tyler's gut, knocking the air from his lungs. His knees buckled, and before he could regain control, Jaden was on him, driving him backward, forcing him off balance, pinning him against the brick wall. The fight was over. Tyler knew it. Jaden could see it in his eyes. The sudden realization that the balance had shifted, that he wasn't the one in control anymore. For years, Tyler had tormented him, beaten him, humiliated him, had built his own image off the idea that Jaden would never fight back, that he would always stay down, that he would always be someone to laugh at, to push around. Not anymore. Jaden leaned in slightly, his voice calm, steady, final. "You're done." Tyler swallowed hard, but said nothing. Jaden held his gaze for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of it settle. Then, finally, he stepped back. Tyler stayed against the wall for a second longer, breathing hard, eyes darting away. And then, without another word, he turned and ran away. Jaden watched him go, heart still steady, breath still even. He could feel the ache in his knuckles, the bruises already forming along his ribs, but none of it mattered, because this time, he hadn't lost. This time, Tyler had been the one to walk away. The walk home felt different. The world wasn't any quieter, wasn't any brighter, and yet, something had shifted. The weight that had sat in Jaden's chest for so long, pressing against his ribs, making every breath feel heavy, was gone. Not just lifted, gone. He could still feel the ache in his knuckles, the dull sting in his ribs where Tyler had landed a hit before everything had turned against him, but none of it mattered, because for the first time, he had won. Not just a fight, not just some scrap behind the school. He had won himself back. Tyler wasn't untouchable anymore. He wasn't the force he had spent years convincing everyone he was. He had swung. He had fought, and he had lost. That changed everything. The thought carried him all the way to his doorstep, the familiar scent of home drifting into his lungs the second he stepped inside, the hum of the television in the background, the faint clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Everything felt the same, But Jaden knew he wasn't walking into this house the same way he had yesterday. His father was in the living room, his usual place on the couch, a bottle of water in one hand, remote in the other, flipping through the channels without much interest. He didn't look up immediately, didn't ask anything the second Jaden walked through the door. But Jaden knew he had already seen. It was in the slight shift of his shoulders, the way his grip on the remote paused just for a second, before he finally turned his head, eyes locking onto his son. And just like that, Daniel Carter knew. He set the remote down, exhaling through his nose. "You did it." Jaden let out a breath, nodding slowly. "I did it." For a second, neither of them said anything. Then, just like that, Daniel laughed. A sharp, genuine sound that barely ever made its way past his lips. A sound Jaden had heard so rarely, it almost startled him. But there it was. Pride. Real. Unfiltered pride. His father pushed himself up from the couch, stepping forward, pressing a firm hand against Jaden's shoulder, giving it a shake. "Damn right you did." Jaden hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear that. The tension that had still been lingering in his chest. The last traces of doubt, of wondering if this victory had truly meant something, all of it disappeared under the weight of those words, under the solid grip of his father's hand, the silent acknowledgement that everything he had gone through, everything he had endured, had led to this moment. For the first time, he wasn't just Daniel Carter's son. He was a fighter in his own right. Daniel gave his shoulder one last shake before stepping back, exhaling, "Tell me everything." And so, Jaden did. Every detail, every moment, the way Tyler had looked at him before the fight, the way his fists had finally moved without hesitation, without fear, the way Tyler had backed down, had walked away, knowing he had lost. Every second of it mattered, because every second of it had been a moment where Jaden had taken something back. Daniel listened, arms crossed, nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable, though Jaden could still see the small traces of pride behind his eyes. But when Jaden finally finished, when he let out a breath, waiting for his father's reaction, Daniel's expression shifted. The pride didn't disappear, but something else settled in its place. A different kind of knowing, a different kind of lesson. "You're feeling good right now," Daniel said finally, stepping back, moving toward the kitchen where a half-full glass of water sat on the counter. He grabbed it, taking a sip before looking back at Jaden. "And you should. You earned it." Jaden nodded, but his father wasn't done. "But understand something," Daniel continued, setting the glass down. "That fight, it doesn't end just because you won." His eyes darkened slightly, voice dipping into something lower, something more serious. "You put him in his place, but people like him. They don't forget that, and they don't take losing lightly." Jaden felt something cold slip down his spine. He hadn't thought about that. Not yet. Tyler's pride isn't gone. It's just bruised, Daniel said, watching his son closely. "And the worst thing you can do right now is let your guard down." Jaden inhaled slowly. His father wasn't wrong. He had seen it in Tyler's eyes before he walked away. That burning, that silent rage that came with knowing your entire world had just shifted against you. Tyler had lost today, but that didn't mean he was done. Daniel must have seen the realization settle in because he finally exhaled, stepping forward, placing both hands on Jaden's shoulders. "This is where discipline matters," he said, voice steady. "You fought for your respect. You fought for your place. Now, you protect it." Jaden swallowed, nodding slowly. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something bigger. His father squeezed his shoulders one last time before letting go, stepping back. "Now," Daniel said, smirking slightly, the weight of the conversation lifting just enough for the moment to breathe again. "I think this calls for a celebration." Jaden raised a brow. "Celebration?" Daniel motioned toward the kitchen, already moving toward the cabinets. "You think I'd let my son go through all that training just to come home and eat whatever we got in the fridge? Hell no! I'm making steaks." Jaden blinked. "Wait, you actually cook?" Daniel shot him a look. "I can make a damn steak, Jaden. Don't insult me." Jaden smirked, shaking his head. the weight in his chest finally settling into something lighter. Victory tasted good. But just as he was about to help set up, just as the moment had begun to truly feel like something worth holding on to, there was a sharp, heavy pounding at the front door. The entire atmosphere shifted. Daniel stilled. Jaden turned toward the entrance, the sound echoing through the house, shaking the walls. The kind of knock that wasn't a request, but a demand. His father exhaled slowly, cracking his neck, rolling his shoulders back like a man who already knew exactly what was waiting for him on the other side. And just like that, Jaden knew too. Tyler hadn't forgotten. Daniel walked toward the door, steps calm, controlled, deliberate. Jaden felt his pulse pick up, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something else, something sharper, something that whispered, this fight wasn't over, not yet. The pounding at the door came again, harder this time, each impact rattling the frame, sending a deep, vibrating pulse through the quiet of the house. Jaden stood frozen for a brief moment, the weight of everything settling in all at once. The fight, the victory, the warning his father had just given him. This wasn't over. Daniel Carter exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back, straightening his stance, preparing. There was no hesitation in his steps as he moved toward the door, no uncertainty in the way his hand gripped the knob, no moment of pause before he yanked it open, revealing exactly what he had been expecting. Richard Reynolds. The man stood on the doorstep, broad and imposing, his features contorted with something between anger and barely controlled rage. His light blue button-up was wrinkled, the sleeves pushed to his elbows, as if he had stormed out of his house in a hurry, fists clenching and unclenching at his sides, his eyes, cold, sharp, filled with the same condescension and entitlement his son carried, locked onto Daniel's the second the door swung open. There was a pause, a long, heavy silence where the air itself thickened between them, both men sizing the other up in an instant. Then Richard let out a sharp breath, shaking his head slightly, his lips curling in a sneer. "You've got some nerve." Daniel didn't move, didn't blink. "You're standing on my doorstep, pounding on my door like you're about to issue a warrant. So how about you just say what you came here to say and get to the point?" Richard's expression darkened. "You know exactly why I'm here." Daniel lifted a brow, arms crossing over his chest. "No, but I have a feeling you're about to tell me." Richard took a step forward, invasive, posturing, puffing up his chest like the sheer weight of his presence was supposed to do something. "Your son put his hands on my boy today. Left him bleeding, bruised. My kid walks through this town with my name, and now people are whispering like he's some kind of—" His voice cut off for a moment, his jaw clenching. "You think I'm gonna let that slide?" Daniel didn't flinch. He had seen this kind of man 1,000 times before, the kind who mistook privilege for power, the kind who believed respect was something they were owed instead of something they had to earn, the kind who had never had to answer for their actions, who had never once been held accountable because the world had always let them believe they were untouchable. And he could see, clear as day, that Richard's anger had nothing to do with his son being hurt. It had to do with the fact that his son had lost. Daniel exhaled, slow and measured, shaking his head slightly. "Let me guess," he said, voice calm, unreadable. "Tyler told you he was minding his own business, that Jaden just came out of nowhere and attacked him, and you believed it. That about right?" Richard scoffed. "You calling my kid a liar?" Daniel's lips twitched, something cold passing through his eyes. "I'm calling him your kid." Richard's hands clenched at his sides. "Say that again?" Daniel took a step forward now, closing the distance between them, his expression unwavering. "I said, your son is a liar. He has been since the day he learned he could get away with it." Richard's face twisted. But before he could speak, before he could launch into whatever self-righteous tirade he had been rehearsing on the drive over, Daniel kept going. "My son's been coming home with bruises for months, and I let it go. I let it go because I wanted him to learn how to pick his battles, wanted him to understand that some things aren't worth the fight. But Tyler didn't stop, because kids like him never stop, not until they realize they aren't the biggest dog in the yard. So he pushed, and he pushed, and then today, he got what was coming to him. Daniel's voice never wavered, never rose, but there was something lethal buried beneath every word. And now you're standing here at my door, trying to turn this into something it isn't, trying to pretend like your son is the victim. Richard let out a bitter, humorless laugh, shaking his head. You people are unbelievable. And there it was. Jayden felt his stomach tighten, felt his fists clench at his sides, but his father didn't react, didn't even blink, as if he had already been expecting it. You act like you're better than us, Richard continued, voice laced with venom now, his posture shifting as his anger took on a new edge. Like you don't know your place, like you're not standing in a house you shouldn't even own, in a neighborhood you don't belong in, raising a son who... Daniel moved. It was fast. So fast that for a split second, Richard actually flinched, his body stiffening as if preparing for something physical. But Daniel didn't lay a hand on him, didn't raise his fists, didn't react with anything but cold, unshakable restraint. Instead, he simply stepped forward, just enough that Richard had no choice but to take a step back, just enough that the shift in power was immediate, undeniable. You want to talk about places? Daniel's voice was low now, deadly quiet. Then listen real close, because I want to make sure you hear me, Reynolds. My son is not beneath yours. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. And the only reason I'm still standing here having this conversation, instead of handling this the way men like you actually deserve, is because I want to make sure you understand something real clear. The next time your son tries this, the next time he lays a hand on my kid, I won't be the one holding him back. Richard's face twisted into something unreadable. For the first time, he looked unsure. Daniel held his gaze for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of his words settle. Then, finally, he took a step back, exhaling sharply. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got dinner to finish. And with that, he slammed the door in Richard Reynolds's face. The silence that followed was thick, charged with the kind of tension that didn't just dissolve. Daniel could still feel it in his chest as he stepped back toward the kitchen, rolling his shoulders, trying to shake off the weight of the confrontation that had just taken place. He had dealt with men like Richard Reynolds before, men who had never been told no, who had never lost, who carried their superiority like armor until the moment it was stripped away. But this wasn't over. Jayden could feel it too, the way his father's movements were precise, measured, but his jaw was still clenched, his hands flexing at his sides. There was something unfinished lingering in the air, something waiting to explode. And then the pounding started again. This time, it wasn't just a knock. It was violent, erratic, a fist slamming against wood, over and over, sending deep, shaking echoes through the house. Then came the voice, raw, ragged with fury, all pretense of composure gone. "Open the damn door, Carter!" Jayden tensed instantly, his stomach knotting, his body still on edge from everything that had happened just minutes before. He turned, his eyes flickering toward his father, expecting him to hesitate, to think through the situation before making a move. But Daniel was already moving. His steps were calm, controlled, but unyielding as he made his way toward the door, not even pausing before yanking it open. And there was Richard Reynolds, his face flushed red with fury, his breath coming fast, his fists still clenched at his sides. Whatever restraint he had been clinging to before, whatever polished self-control he had walked up to this house with the first time, it was gone now. "You think you can slam the door in my face?" Richard spat, his voice hoarse, eyes wild. "You think you can stand there and talk down to me? Like I'm just some—" Daniel tilted his head slightly, watching him with a kind of detached amusement. "Some what?" Richard's hands twitched, like they wanted to move, but weren't sure how to. His breaths were sharp and uneven, his chest rising and falling fast, his body vibrating with unchecked rage. "I've had enough of your mouth," he growled. Daniel exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "And yet, here you are, still running yours." That was it. That was all it took. Richard lunged. The movement was fast, but not fast enough. His hands barely made it past Daniel's chest before he was stopped cold. A single, sharp motion cutting through his momentum like it was nothing. Daniel's arm snapped forward, his grip latching onto Richard's wrist, twisting it just enough to send a shockwave of pain through his joints without actually breaking anything. Richard let out a choked sound, stumbling forward, thrown off balance. And that was the first mistake. Daniel could have ended it right there, could have snapped his wrist, shoved him back, thrown him to the ground with the same efficiency he had used on men twice his size during combat deployments. But he didn't, because this wasn't just about winning. This was about teaching. Richard recovered, yanking his arm back, his fury doubling as he threw a wild, uncalculated punch. But Daniel saw it coming long before it was thrown. He shifted, weaving around it so smoothly that it almost looked slow motion, his body barely moving as the strike sailed past him and hit nothing but air. And then Daniel stepped in. One solid push to Richard's chest sent him stumbling back, his feet scrambling against the pavement. The first burst of laughter came from the sidewalk. Richard froze, his head snapping toward the source. Neighbors. People had started gathering, some standing in their driveways, others pulling out their phones, recording. Richard's face twisted. Daniel smirked. "Didn't think this one through, did you?" Richard's jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. And then, like a cornered animal, he charged. His body slammed forward, all power, no precision. He wasn't thinking. He wasn't strategizing. He was furious, humiliated, desperate to reclaim control. Daniel didn't even move at first, didn't shift until the exact moment the weight of Richard's body was fully committed. And then he pivoted. A sharp twist, a clean motion, and in an instant, Richard's entire body was redirected, his own weight betraying him. 1 second, he was charging. The next, he was on his knees, his arm locked in an iron-tight hold, his body completely restrained. A headlock, clean, effortless, unbreakable. Richard struggled, gasping, his face turning red, his hands clawing uselessly at Daniel's forearm, but it was no use. The laughter grew. People were watching, recording. And that was when reality set in. Richard, once the man with all the control, the man who had pounded on this door expecting to be feared, to be respected, to be obeyed, was now the spectacle. The pathetic, writhing fool on the pavement, gasping for breath while the man he had come to intimidate barely looked winded. Daniel leaned in slightly, his voice low, calm, only for Richard to hear. "You should have walked away." Richard stopped struggling. Daniel let the moment stretch just long enough. Long enough for Richard to fully understand what had just happened. Long enough for the weight of the humiliation to settle deep in his gut. Then, finally, he released him. Richard collapsed onto the pavement, coughing, breathless, his body shaking with adrenaline and fury and shame. His eyes darted up, taking in the phones pointed at him, the quiet murmurs, the chuckles, the whispers of disbelief. And for the first time, he didn't have anything to say. Daniel exhaled, rolling his shoulders, adjusting his stance. "Are we done here?" Richard didn't answer, didn't move, didn't even look at him. Daniel smirked. "That's what I thought." And without another word, he turned and walked back inside, closing the door behind him. Jaden let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His father said nothing at first, just rolled his neck, his posture completely relaxed, as if he hadn't just dismantled a grown man in front of the entire neighborhood. Then he looked at Jaden, tilting his head slightly. "Go ahead and eat," he said, voice casual. "Steak's probably cold by now." Jaden blinked, staring. And then he laughed. The air at Ridgewood High was different. It wasn't obvious at first, not in a way that most people would consciously acknowledge. But Jayden felt it the second he stepped through the doors. The subtle shift in the way conversations paused just slightly when he walked past. The way heads turned toward him more than usual. The way eyes that had once barely acknowledged his existence lingered. Something had changed. The whispers followed him down the hall. Low, hushed voices, laughter in the distance, murmured phrases just quiet enough that he couldn't catch them, but loud enough that he knew exactly what they were about. He had expected this, had known that the fight with Tyler wouldn't just disappear, but as he passed a group of juniors near the lockers, one of them barely concealing a grin as he nudged his friend and whispered something, Jayden realized they weren't laughing at him anymore. They were laughing at Tyler. The weight of that realization settled deep in his chest, slow and steady, stretching through his body like a long exhale after holding his breath for too long. For so long, this school had felt like something he had to navigate carefully, like every step was meant to keep him from slipping into the crosshairs. Now, it didn't feel like that anymore, and then it happened. At first, it was subtle, a casual nod from a guy he had never spoken to before. A "Yo, that was wild, man," from someone who had never so much as looked in his direction before today. Then, in second period, a girl named Lisa Carter, one of the more well-known students, not quite at the top of the school's social hierarchy, but high enough that people paid attention to her, turned to him just before class started. "So, is it true?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Jayden frowned. "Is what true?" Lisa smirked. "That you knocked Tyler on his butt so hard his dad had to come crying to your house about it." A few people around them laughed under their breath, pretending not to listen, but definitely listening. Jayden exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Something like that." Lisa's smirk widened. "About damn time." Jayden raised a brow, glancing at her. "You don't like Tyler?" Lisa scoffed. "Nobody likes Tyler. People just tolerate him because of who his dad is." Jayden blinked, something clicking in his mind. It wasn't that people had been blind to Tyler's behavior all these years. It was that they had been too scared to do anything about it. Now, they weren't. Lisa leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Word is, his dad got handled even worse than he did." Jayden smirked, shaking his head. "I wouldn't know anything about that." Lisa grinned. "Sure." She turned back in her seat, just as the teacher entered, but not before adding, "You should sit with us at lunch." Jayden barely had time to process that before the lesson began. But even as the teacher started speaking, he could feel the eyes on him. The shift in perception. For the first time, people weren't looking at him like a victim. They were looking at him like someone who had changed the game. By the time lunch rolled around, the shift in energy had only grown stronger. The moment Jayden stepped into the cafeteria, he could feel it. The low hum of curiosity. The way conversations subtly redirected toward him. This time, when he grabbed his tray, nobody knocked it out of his hands. Lisa waved him over to a table near the center of the room, where she was sitting with a small group of students, most of whom he recognized but had never spoken to before. For the first time, he wasn't walking toward an empty table. The moment he sat down, someone else leaned in. Derek Thompson, a senior, wide-shouldered, one of the football guys, but not the obnoxious type. "You really took down Tyler?" Derek asked, resting his arms on the table. Jayden took a bite of his food, chewing slowly before answering. "Yeah." Derek let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "Man, I wish I could have seen it. That guy's been running his mouth since freshman year." "Yeah." Another guy chimed in. "Nobody's ever put him in his place like that before." Jayden exhaled, shaking his head. "It wasn't about that." Derek raised a brow. "Then, what was it about?" Jayden thought about that for a moment, then shrugged. "It was about making sure he never did it again?" Derek nodded, seeming to accept that answer. "Well, either way, man. Respect." He raised his fist, and without thinking, Jayden bumped it. Something so small, so insignificant to anyone else, but to him, it felt like something he had never had before. He wasn't just being tolerated anymore. He was being included. And then the moment shifted, because across the cafeteria, standing just near the entrance, was Tyler. His face was still bruised, the fading shades of purple and yellow lining his jaw, but that wasn't what caught Jaden's attention. It was his eyes. For the first time, Tyler wasn't looking at him with arrogance. He wasn't smirking, wasn't making his way over with his usual bravado, wasn't cracking his knuckles like he had something to prove. He was just standing there, watching, silent. There was something different in his face now. A realization, a hesitation, a moment of reckoning where he finally understood that nothing would ever be the same. Jaden held his gaze, calm, unbothered, meeting him with a look that said everything without saying anything at all. Tyler didn't move, didn't speak, and then, finally, he looked away, turned around, walked out of the cafeteria. Jaden exhaled slowly, his hands relaxing at his sides. The email arrived that evening. Jaden had been sitting in the living room, scrolling through his phone, a small smirk tugging at the edges of his lips as he skimmed through a group chat that had started circulating around Ridgewood High, a thread filled with jokes about Tyler's downfall, about how the school had needed someone to knock him down a peg for years, and now, finally, someone had done it. It was surreal, seeing his name pop up in messages that weren't insults, weren't attached to some joke at his expense. This was different. This was respect. And then, from the kitchen, his father's voice cut through the air. "Jaden, come here." Something in his tone sent a chill through his spine. Jaden stood quickly, pushing off the couch and making his way into the kitchen, where Daniel was seated at the table, laptop open in front of him, his expression unreadable. The glow of the screen cast sharp shadows against his face, his jaw tight, the faint flicker of restrained anger behind his eyes. Jaden stepped closer. "What is it?" Daniel didn't look up at first, just let out a slow, controlled breath before turning the screen slightly so Jaden could see. And there it was, an official notice from the Ridgewood High School board. The words stood out in bold, clear, professional type. "Urgent, emergency hearing regarding student conduct. Jaden Carter." His stomach dropped. "They're calling a hearing?" he asked, his voice even, but his heart hammering against his ribs. Daniel's jaw ticked. "Not just a hearing," he said, voice calm, measured in a way that told Jaden he was already fighting back a storm of anger. "They're calling for your expulsion." Jaden inhaled sharply. But he shouldn't have been surprised. He should have seen this coming. This wasn't about the fight. This was Richard. This was him, pulling strings, making calls, twisting the system to work in his favor the way men like him always did, the way they always had, the way they always would, unless someone finally stopped them. Jaden's hands clenched at his sides. He couldn't beat you, so now he's trying to do this instead. Daniel exhaled slowly, nodding. "It was never about Tyler," he murmured. "It was always about power, about control." His fingers tapped lightly against the table, his mind already working, already planning, already moving pieces the same way he had done 100 times before on a battlefield. Jaden looked at the email again, his throat tightening at the way it was worded, cold, procedural, as if what they were talking about was some minor disciplinary matter, rather than a deliberate attempt to destroy his future. "This is insane," Jaden muttered, shaking his head. "They have to know he started it. They have to know." "They don't care," Daniel cut in, his voice sharp but not unkind. "Richard isn't playing fair. He never was. He doesn't need the truth. He just needs enough leverage to make it look like he's right." Jaden swallowed hard, his stomach twisting. His father leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "The hearing's in 2 days," he said, voice calm but heavy with meaning. "That's all the time we have to prepare." Jaden looked at him, waiting for direction, for the plan, for whatever strategy Daniel had already formed in his mind. But instead, his father exhaled slowly and met his gaze. "You up for this?" Jaden let the silence stretch, let the question settle deep in his chest. let the weight of everything press down on him all at once. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I'm ready." The boardroom wasn't designed for tension, but the air inside was thick with it. A long, polished wooden table sat in the center of the room, lined with school board members, their faces a mixture of indifference, authority, and quiet curiosity. Principal Harris sat at the end, hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression carefully neutral. Jaden sat beside his father on one side of the table. Richard and Tyler sat on the other. Jaden could feel Tyler's eyes on him, but he didn't look back, because it wasn't about him anymore. Richard, however, wasn't hiding his smugness. He leaned back slightly in his chair, arms crossed, his mouth curled into the faintest smirk, his entire posture screaming confidence, certainty, the assurance of a man who had spent his entire life bending the system in his favor. Jaden could see it now. He expected to win, expected the board to side with him, expected them to nod along, agree with his carefully crafted narrative, expected this to end with Jaden walking out of here with nothing but a bag full of regrets and an expulsion notice. And then the board president cleared his throat. "This hearing is now in session," he announced, straightening his tie. "Mr. Reynolds, since you initiated this process, you may present your case first." Richard leaned forward, his smirk growing. "Thank you," he said smoothly, his voice measured, practiced, like he had already won. And then, with a single breath, he launched into his performance, a twisted version of the truth, carefully curated. How his son had been attacked without provocation, how Jaden had instigated the fight, how the school had allowed an aggressive student to target and assault his son while doing nothing to protect him. He spoke about safety, responsibility, discipline. Every word was perfectly crafted, expertly spun, tailored to appeal to the right ears, the right biases, the right authority figures. By the time he finished, a heavy silence hung over the room. And then Daniel Carter spoke. No, the single word was calm, unshaken, cutting through the silence with the weight of something immovable. Richard blinked. "Excuse me?" Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "No," he repeated, voice smooth, controlled, but carrying something beneath it that made the entire room feel smaller. "That's not what happened. And you know it." Richard's face twitched. Daniel didn't give him the chance to recover. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and placed it on the table. With a single tap, the video played. The fight. The real fight. The one that had started with Tyler throwing the first punch. The one that had ended with him on the ground. And then, a second video. The footage of Richard himself, screaming, pounding on their door, throwing his fists at a man who never lifted a hand in return. The footage of him being humiliated in his own fight, caught in a headlock, gasping for air, while the neighborhood watched. By the time the video stopped, the air was so thick it was suffocating. Richard's face had gone pale, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. And when Daniel spoke again, his voice was calm, steady, final. "The only violent people in this room," he said, eyes locked onto Richard's, "are sitting on that side of the table." The board members shifted. The principal cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable. The room was silent. Not just quiet, silent. Not the kind of silence that came from decorum or professionalism. Not the silence of respect. No. This was something else entirely. This was the silence of a man who had lost control. Richard Reynolds sat rigid in his chair, his breath uneven, his face a shade paler than it had been just moments ago. His fingers still gripped the edges of the table, knuckles stark white against the polished wood. He had walked into this hearing expecting to win. He had expected to dominate the room the way he always did. Expected to talk his way into getting what he wanted, expected the same unspoken privileges that had always worked in his favor. But now, he was just another man backed into a corner, and the entire room knew it. No one spoke. Not the board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats, not the principal, who was suddenly so focused on the papers in front of him that it looked like he was trying to will himself invisible. Not even Tyler. Especially not Tyler. The boy who had always been loud, smug, arrogant, dripping with the same untouchable attitude his father carried, now sat small, hunched, his head slightly lowered, his jaw clenched tight. He wasn't looking at anyone. Not at his father, not at Jaden, not even at the board members whose decision could very well change his future. He knew what was coming, and so did everyone else. Daniel Carter exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, completely composed. He had already won. The only thing left was letting them catch up to that fact. The school board president cleared his throat, shifting his weight in his chair. "Mr. Carter," he said finally, his voice tight, controlled. "How exactly did you obtain these videos?" Daniel arched a brow, his expression unreadable. Concerned about privacy now? The president stiffened slightly, but Daniel didn't wait for a response. He reached forward, calmly locking his phone and placing it flat on the table. "The fight video came from students," he said simply. "You might have noticed, but kids these days, they record everything." He gestured lightly toward Jaden. "Word got around fast. Plenty of them were happy to send me a copy." Jaden had barely needed to ask. The second he walked into school that morning, his phone had been lighting up with messages. Some were from people he barely even knew, students who had watched the fight firsthand, who had recorded it from a distance, who had seen Tyler go down and wanted to be the first to make sure it spread. The files had come flooding in. Multiple angles, multiple perspectives, undeniable proof that Tyler had started the fight. And as for the other video, Daniel smirked slightly. "And the footage of our little doorstep conversation?" He shrugged. "Let's just say your tantrum was loud enough to draw a crowd. That part hadn't even been intentional." Daniel had known the moment he put Richard in that headlock that word would spread, that people would talk, that there would be witnesses. But what he hadn't expected was the fact that half the neighborhood had recorded it. His phone had been buzzing all night with messages from neighbors, some amused, some impressed, some outright laughing as they sent over clips taken from front porches, doorbell cameras, even one shaky recording from across the street, where the audio had caught Richard's voice almost perfectly. Daniel hadn't even asked for most of them. They had just come to him. Because Ridgewood, for all its silence over the years, for all its refusal to ever step in, had seen something change. And now, so had the school board. The president let out a slow breath, his fingers drumming lightly against the table, his gaze flickering toward Richard, whose face had gone so stiff it looked carved from stone. "Mr. Reynolds," the president said, voice firm, "do you have anything to say?" Richard's nostrils flared, his fingers twitched, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. The board president nodded slightly, as if that was all he needed to hear, before turning his attention back to Daniel. "Mr. Carter," he said, "based on the evidence presented today, and after reviewing the circumstances surrounding the incident, the board sees no reason to pursue disciplinary action against Jaden Carter." Jaden exhaled, slow and steady. There it was, the final word. Daniel just nodded once. "Good." The president cleared his throat, turning toward Richard now. "As for Tyler Reynolds, given his repeated disciplinary history and his involvement in this incident, we will be placing him on probationary suspension. Further violations will result in expulsion." Richard jerked upright. "You can't be serious." "This hearing is now concluded." The president cut him off smoothly, already standing. The decision had been made, and Richard Reynolds had officially lost. The board members rose, some already gathering their papers, not bothering to look at Richard as they filed out. The principal followed suit, his silence as damning as any ruling. And then it was just them. For a long moment, no one moved. Jaden watched as Richard sat there, his entire body stiff, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so hard it looked like he might snap them in half. Tyler still hadn't looked up. And then, slowly, stiffly, Richard turned his head, his eyes locking onto Daniel's. Daniel just smirked. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The silence between them said it all. Finally, Richard stood. He moved like a man who had just been stripped of everything he had once held dear. A man who had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable, only to find out, in the worst possible way, that he wasn't. He turned toward Tyler. His voice clipped, sharp. "Let's go." Tyler didn't argue, didn't say anything, didn't even glance at Jaden as he pushed back his chair and followed his father out of the room. Jaden watched them go, watched as Richard stormed out the door without so much as looking back. And then, just like that, the air in the room suddenly felt lighter. Jaden exhaled, turning toward his father. But Daniel was already pushing himself up from his chair, rolling his shoulders, stretching slightly. "Well," Daniel said casually, "that was fun." Jaden let out a breath of laughter, shaking his head. And as they stepped out into the hallway, walking away from the room where justice had finally been served, Jaden knew this wasn't just about a fight anymore. This was the moment everything changed. The night air was crisp, cool against Jaden's skin as he stepped out of the steakhouse, his stomach full, the weight of everything that had happened finally beginning to settle into something real. He had thought it would feel different, thought that after all the fighting, the tension, the moments of doubt, there would be some massive wave of relief that crashed over him the second they walked out of that school board meeting. But instead, it felt quieter, more like a deep breath after holding it in for too long. Daniel walked beside him, just as calm, just as measured. As they made their way across the lot toward the truck, he hadn't said much over dinner. Just let Jaden talk, let him breathe through the moment, let him process the victory, without the weight of a lesson attached to it. And now, as they reached the truck, Daniel stretched his arms above his head, exhaling in satisfaction. "You realize what this means, right?" he said, glancing over at Jaden with a smirk. Jaden raised a brow. "What?" Daniel nodded toward the restaurant behind them. "We just ate the best steak in town on Richard Reynolds's failed vendetta. I gotta say, justice tastes good." Jaden huffed a laugh, shaking his head as he climbed into the passenger seat. His father's humor had a way of sneaking up on him. Dry, unexpected, but always perfectly timed. Daniel started the truck, pulling out of the lot and onto the road, his fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was earned. The fight was over. The board had spoken. Tyler had been put in his place. And Richard had been broken. But the thing about men like Richard was that they didn't just accept loss. Jaden hadn't thought about it much. Not since leaving that boardroom, not since watching Richard and Tyler storm out, humiliated, defeated. But now, as the truck rumbled down the road, a feeling settled in the back of his mind. Something wasn't right. Daniel must have felt it too, because after a few minutes, his fingers stopped tapping against the wheel. His posture stiffened, his eyes flickering toward the rearview mirror, watching. Jaden noticed the shift immediately. "What?" he asked, straightening in his seat. Daniel didn't answer at first, didn't take his eyes off the mirror, didn't break the stillness in his expression. But then, after a long moment, he exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "We're being followed." Jaden's breath hitched, his spine going rigid. He turned his head slightly, trying not to be obvious as he glanced toward the mirror. There. A black SUV. Dark windows. Close enough to be noticed. Far enough to pretend like it was just another car on the road. Jaden swallowed. "How long?" Daniel turned onto a side road, watching. The SUV turned with them. "Since we left the restaurant," he said simply. Jaden's pulse picked up. "You think it's him?" Daniel let out a humorless chuckle. "I'd bet tomorrow's paycheck on it." Jaden's jaw clenched. "I'd bet tomorrow's paycheck on it." Jaden's jaw clenched. "What do we do?" Daniel sighed, rolling his shoulders back as if he had already made his decision long before Jaden had even asked. "We finish this." With that, he slowed the truck, pulling off to the side of the road. The SUV hesitated. Then, slowly, it followed suit. The second the vehicles came to a stop, Daniel opened his door, stepping out without an ounce of hesitation. his posture relaxed, but his presence unmistakably commanding. Jaden followed, his body tense, his pulse hammering in his throat, as the doors of the SUV swung open, revealing exactly what he expected. Richard Reynolds. But this time, he wasn't alone. 3 other men climbed out with him, all built like they had spent their best years trying to look tougher than they actually were. Their expressions lined with the same entitlement, the same unchecked hatred that clung to Richard like a second skin. Jaden didn't know their names, didn't need to. He knew their type. Richard stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate, but his face was something else entirely. The humiliation, the fury, the unchecked rage that had been building inside him ever since he lost. It was all there, bare, open, ugly in the way men like him became when they had nothing left to hold on to. "You got a lot of nerve, Carter," Richard said, his voice sharp, simmering. "Embarrassing me like that? In front of my son? In front of the whole damn town?" Daniel let out a slow breath, tilting his head slightly. "Didn't need my help for that, Reynolds. You did just fine all on your own." Richard's eyes darkened. His fists twitched. One of the men beside him let out a quiet, low chuckle. "Man's got a mouth on him, huh?" Daniel didn't even glance at them, didn't acknowledge them at all. His attention was locked onto Richard, unwavering. "I knew you'd come," Daniel murmured, voice smooth, unreadable. "Men like you always do." Richard sneered. "Men like me?" Daniel exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "You had to bring backup," he said, gesturing slightly toward the other men. "You needed to, didn't you? Couldn't handle me on your own. So now you're hoping that numbers will change something." He took a slow step forward, his eyes locked onto Richard's, with something dark, something cold, something that said he had already sized up the entire situation and knew exactly how it was going to end. "Go on, Reynolds," he said quietly. "Tell me how this is supposed to go." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line, but his fists clenched tighter. One of the other men scoffed, shaking his head. "Man, you gonna let him talk to you like that?" Richard barely moved, but Jaden could see the moment he snapped. "Damn right. I brought backup," Richard growled, stepping forward, his posture bulging with false confidence. "You think I was going to let you make a fool out of me, out of my family, and just get away with it? You think you get to walk around like you own this town? Like you belong here?" Daniel exhaled slowly, his expression never wavering. "I don't need to act like I belong here," he said evenly. "I already do." Richard's breath hitched. The night air was thick with tension, humming with the kind of energy that settled in the space just before violence erupted. Jaden could feel it in his bones. His pulse was steady, controlled, his breath even, but his hands had already curled into fists, his instincts screaming that this moment, this exact moment, was where everything finally came to a head. He stood just a few steps behind his father, close enough to move if needed, but not close enough to be a distraction. Not yet. His fingers hovered over his phone in his pocket, his mind flashing back to what had happened at the school board, to the way his father had turned the tide with undeniable evidence, to the way Richard had looked when he realized he had lost. Jaden had a feeling tonight would need its own evidence. So, slowly, subtly, he pulled out his phone and hit record. Richard's chest rose and fell with deep, erratic breaths, his body practically shaking with fury as he stood in front of them, flanked by his 3 friends. They weren't kids like Tyler. They were men, older, heavier, meaner. Their presence alone was a message, a statement that this wasn't meant to be a fair fight. Daniel Carter didn't look impressed. He tilted his head slightly, exhaling, his stance relaxed, his entire body loose but ready. He had seen men like this before. Too confident, too reliant on strength, too blinded by their own egos to realize what they were stepping into. "You should have stayed home, Reynolds," Daniel said, voice calm, measured, completely unshaken. Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "You still don't get it, do you?" He gestured to his men, his smirk widening as he squared his shoulders. "You think I was just gonna let you humiliate me? Make a joke out of my family?" Daniel arched a brow, unimpressed. "You did that all on your own." Richard's face twisted with rage. Then he lunged, and just like that, the fight began. The first punch came fast, wild, reckless, fueled by anger instead of strategy. Daniel sidestepped it effortlessly, his body shifting just enough to let the momentum pass by harmlessly. Richard stumbled forward, off balance, completely open. Daniel struck fast. A clean, sharp jab straight to the ribs, knocking the air from Richard's lungs before he could even recover. But the others were already moving. One of Richard's men, a thick-necked guy with fists the size of bricks, rushed in next, swinging low. Daniel pivoted, catching the arm mid-motion, twisting just enough to send him sprawling forward, face first into the dirt. The second man lunged, faster, smarter, aiming high. This one was more controlled, his movements sharper. But Daniel had spent his entire life reading fighters before they even threw their first punch. He stepped inside the attack, caught the incoming fist on his forearm, redirected the force, and sent a brutal knee straight to the man's gut. The sound of air rushing out of his lungs was audible even over the scuffle, his body doubling over in an instant. But it was still 3 against 1. The third man, seeing his opening, came at Daniel from behind. Silent, quick, aiming for the blind spot. Jaden didn't hesitate. He moved purely on instinct, stepping forward, his foot sweeping out in a clean, well-timed trip, knocking the man's legs out from under him just before he could reach his father. Daniel didn't even turn. He had already felt the shift in movement, already sensed Jaden's intervention, already anticipated the moment the third man hit the ground, grunting as his shoulders slammed into the pavement. Richard roared in frustration, lunging again, this time putting his full weight into a tackle. Daniel let him come. He absorbed the impact, shifted his stance, and used the momentum against him, twisting Richard's body mid-motion, sending them both crashing down. But only one of them landed in control. By the time the dust settled, Daniel was on top, one knee pressing against Richard's chest, his forearm digging against his throat just enough to pin him, to immobilize him, to force him to feel the weight of his own loss. Richard struggled, his hands clawing at Daniel's arm, his breath coming in short, gasping bursts. He was losing. Again. But this time, there was no crowd to watch. No school board, no principal, no cameras rolling from the sidelines, except for one. Jaden stepped closer, his phone still raised, still recording, still capturing every humiliating second. Daniel exhaled slowly, watching Richard's face twist with the slow, dawning realization that there was nothing left for him to do. "You done?" Daniel asked, voice low, calm, lethal in its certainty. Richard let out a choked half-snarl, his body still twitching with the last shreds of his fight. Daniel pressed down slightly, just enough to remind him who was in control. "I said," Daniel repeated, voice cutting through the night like a blade. "Are you done?" Richard finally stilled, defeated. Daniel held him there a second longer, long enough to let the weight of it settle. Then, finally, he released the pressure, standing slowly, letting Richard gasp for air as he rolled onto his side, coughing, shaking. The other 3 men were still down, still groaning, still too winded or too afraid to move. Jaden lowered his phone slightly, taking a slow step forward, his gaze locking onto Richard's as he struggled to sit up. "Here's how this is going to work," Jaden said, his voice steady, stronger than it had ever been before. Richard's bloodshot eyes snapped toward him. "You're going to stay out of our way," Jaden continued, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're not going to go near my dad. You're not going to go near me. You're going to disappear." Richard's lips curled into something bitter, but there was no real fight left in him. Jaden held up his phone slightly, letting the glow of the screen catch Richard's eye. "You even think about showing your face again," Jaden said, voice sharp, cold, final. And I'll make sure the entire town sees this." Richard's nostrils flared. Jaden smirked. "Bet they'd love to watch how you lost a 4-against-1 fight." The words landed like a gunshot. Daniel crossed his arms, watching as Richard's face went tight with the realization of just how deep his humiliation ran. Jaden lowered the phone, pocketing it. "This is over," he said, voice unwavering. "Walk away." Richard hesitated. For a second, it looked like he might try one last act of defiance, one last attempt to hold on to whatever pride he had left. But he didn't. He just pushed himself up onto shaking legs, breathing hard, his entire body defeated in a way that no amount of words could ever undo. And then, finally, he turned and left. Jaden watched as he climbed back into the SUV, his men following without a single word. The tires screeched against the pavement as they sped off into the night, and just like that, it was over. Daniel rolled his shoulders, letting out a slow breath. "Well," he muttered, "that was unnecessary." Jaden chuckled, shaking his head. As they climbed back into the truck, pulling back onto the road, the night air felt different, lighter, like it finally belonged to them. The halls of Ridgewood High felt different now. Not just in the way students glanced in Jaden's direction, not just in the way conversations seemed to shift when he walked past, but in something deeper, something that stretched beyond him, beyond what had happened between him and Tyler, beyond the fights, beyond the battles that had led him here. The power in this school, the unspoken rules, the invisible lines, the hierarchy that had once seemed permanent, had cracked, and everyone felt it. Jaden sat at his usual spot in the cafeteria, except it wasn't really his usual spot anymore. It was better. The table that had once been half empty, the space where he had spent most of his lunches in silence, was now filled. Lisa was there, Derek too. A few others he had never spoken to much before, but who had somehow become part of his new reality. "Guess what I heard this morning?" Lisa asked, a grin tugging at her lips as she leaned forward slightly. Jaden raised a brow. "What?" Lisa glanced around dramatically before lowering her voice. "Tyler transferred." Jaden blinked. "Transferred?" Derek let out a low chuckle. "Dude couldn't show his face here anymore. His dad got wrecked. He got wrecked. And now his whole family's acting like the town's out to get them." Jaden exhaled, shaking his head. So that was it then. After everything. After years of running Ridgewood High like he was untouchable. After getting away with everything. After acting like he would always be on top. Tyler was just gone. It wasn't satisfying in the way Jaden had once imagined. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic exit, no last attempt at redemption or defiance. Tyler had just disappeared, his place in the school erased as if he had never been there at all. Jaden wasn't sure how he felt about that, but then he looked around, at his table, his friends, at the way people talked to him now, not with caution, not with curiosity, but with real respect, real connection, real acknowledgement. He had always thought that winning meant beating Tyler, that everything would feel different when that happened. But now, as he sat there, as laughter rippled through the group, as people talked to him like he had always belonged here, he realized something. Winning wasn't about beating someone else. It was about knowing you didn't need to fight anymore. Lisa nudged his arm, pulling him out of his thoughts. "So, what do you think?" Jaden took a slow breath, then let a small smirk cross his lips. "I think Ridgewood just got a whole lot quieter." Lisa grinned. "Yeah, but not boring. I mean, we still need you on the court for that pickup game after school." Jaden laughed, shaking his head. "We'll see. I don't know if you're ready for me." Derek scoffed. "Oh, he's talking big now." The teasing continued, the conversation flowing naturally, effortlessly, something that would have felt impossible just weeks ago. But now, it felt like it had always been this way. Jaden leaned back in his chair, watching, listening, letting himself settle into this new reality. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. He wasn't walking with his head down. He wasn't carrying a weight on his chest. For the first time, he was just living. And that, more than anything, was the real victory. The drive home was quiet, but it was the good kind of quiet, the kind that didn't need to be filled, the kind that came with a weight that wasn't heavy but settled, like the slow exhale of something finally finished. Jaden sat in the passenger seat, watching the familiar streets pass by through the window, the soft hum of the truck's engine the only sound between them. Daniel had said nothing when he picked him up, just gave him that slight nod of acknowledgement as Jaden slid into the seat, the kind of nod that said he already knew. He didn't have to ask about school, didn't have to ask about how Jaden felt, because he had already seen the answer written all over him. When they pulled into the driveway, Daniel killed the engine, but he didn't move to get out right away. Instead, he sat there for a moment, fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel, his eyes still on the road ahead. Jaden waited, knowing his father had something to say. And then, he did. "You know," Daniel started, exhaling through his nose, "when I was your age, I thought winning was about never losing." He leaned back slightly, tilting his head as if remembering something distant, something long buried. Thought it meant being the strongest, the fastest, the smartest in the room. Thought it meant proving something to everyone who doubted me. Jaden turned his head slightly, listening. Daniel let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Didn't take me long to learn, that wasn't it." His fingers tapped once against the wheel, before finally turning his head toward Jaden. "Winning's not about never losing. It's about what you do after you lose." Jaden let the words settle for a moment. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "You lost before, didn't you?" Jaden swallowed, nodding. "Yeah, but you didn't stay down." Jaden met his father's eyes, something shifting inside his chest, something settling in a way that had nothing to do with the fight, nothing to do with Tyler, but everything to do with what had changed inside him. "I didn't stay down," he said quietly. Daniel nodded, satisfied. Good. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Nothing else needed to be said. Then, finally, Daniel huffed, pushing open his door. "Come on," he said, climbing out of the truck. "I don't know about you, but I'm starving." Jaden smirked, shaking his head as he followed his father inside. The house was warm, familiar, carrying the scent of home. Jaden dropped his bag near the door, stretching his arms over his head as Daniel moved toward the kitchen, already rummaging through the fridge. "You never cook," Jaden teased, leaning against the counter. Daniel shot him a look, pulling out a couple of plates. "I made steaks last time," Jaden chuckled. "Yeah, and I'm still trying to recover from the trauma." Daniel let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You know, for someone who just won the biggest fight of his life, you sure do have a lot to say." Jaden smirked, crossing his arms. "Guess I take after my old man." Daniel paused, just for a second. Then, with the slightest smirk, he shook his head. "Damn right you do." Jaden exhaled, looking around the kitchen, at the familiar walls, at the home that had always been a place of strength, of lessons, of learning. And then, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had truly earned his place in it. His father glanced at him again, his voice softer this time, more real. "I'm proud of you, kid," Jaden swallowed, feeling something tighten in his chest. He nodded. "I know." Daniel let out a small breath, nodding once. Good. And just like that, everything was right. The fight was over. The lessons had been learned. And Jaden Carter had won, not because he beat someone else, but because, for the first time in his life, he knew exactly who he was. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.